You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, and this is the Play Therapy Podcast. In today's episode, we are continuing with the 4 pillars. So we covered reflective responding first, which involves tracking behavior, reflecting content, reflecting feelings. So kind of a 3 part of all the reflective responding. However, reflecting feeling is the emotional. And then choice giving was last episode. So now we're moving into limit setting. And as I mentioned before, I have ordered these differently than Landreth and Bratton did, because I think that if you have reflecting feeling and you have choice giving, those flow into limit setting. And so I think it makes it a little easier when it's done in this order. But if you're used to CPRT or Landreth's model, you will notice that it is in a different order. So moving into limit setting, I want to spend a little bit of time talking through the why behind setting limits before I get into the actual process, because I think that it's just as important to understand the outcome and the intention behind it as I do the actual skill itself. So when we're thinking about limit setting, we want to keep in mind that there needs to be expectations in the playroom. There needs to be an awareness of what is appropriate and what isn't. However, it is not advantageous to set them early or ahead of them being necessary. So one of the rules of thumb in the CPRT program is limits are only needed when they're needed, and limits are not set until they are needed. So when you think in terms of that principle, the guiding undergirding there is that if you constantly share limits with children when they're not necessary, the message is, I don't trust you. I don't believe that you will make the appropriate choice without me intervening or directing or guiding. And so the autonomy and the self-responsibility and the self-control is not developed when we preemptively or proactively set limits, because if we wait until they're needed, it's appropriate in the moment for the behavior. If we set them ahead of time, it communicates mistrust and an expectation of behavior that's inappropriate. So in the Cochran and Cochran book entitled Child-Centered Play Therapy, I refer to it a lot. I want to actually read you a quote because I think this kind of sums up everything that we want to keep in mind when we're working with limits in the playroom. So I'm now quoting from the Cochran and Cochran book. In therapy, there is very little advantage to beginning the counseling relationship by telling the child what is prohibited, and this establishment of rules may serve to challenge some highly resistant or aggressive children to act out, or inhibit more submissive and perfectionistic children from engaging in free play and self-expression. Indeed, the very word rules for most children only serves to create defensive behavior and distancing from the therapist. Let me read that one more time. I know there's a lot there, so I want to make sure that you get it and hear it. In therapy, there is very little advantage to beginning the counseling relationship by telling the child what is prohibited. Let me pause there. I'll tease it apart section by section. So in other words, when the child walks into the playroom for the first time, they don't need a litany of rules and boundaries and expectations set early on, because all it does is create negative outcomes. So when we begin the counseling relationship, we want it to seem freeing. We want it to seem uninhibited. Okay, so back to the quote. This establishment of rules may serve to challenge highly resistant or aggressive children to act out, and we've seen that, right? That's why parents and those types of children are constantly in conflict, because parents are giving rules because they believe that their child is dysregulated and out of control and needs them. But then all it does is create children who want to act out, and they are more resistant because they feel that, okay, you're taking power from me, I'm going to try to grasp it more. Okay, so it can serve to challenge resistant and aggressive children to act out, or it can inhibit more submissive and perfectionistic children from engaging in free play and self-expression. In other words, I'm already timid, I'm already a people pleaser, I'm already submissive, so now you give me a whole bunch of rules, so oh my goodness, now I really have to toe the line. So in either scenario, the outcome is not what we want, especially in a child-centered, non-directive playroom. And then the final part of the quote, indeed, the very word rules for most children only serves to create defensive behavior and distancing from the therapist, which, as we mentioned in so many earlier episodes, we want the connection and the relationship to serve as the center of everything. So we would certainly not want distance between ourselves and the child. We want closeness, we want connection, we want rapport, we want the relationship there, because that is the requirement upon which everything else is built. So when we have this notion of rules creating defensive behavior and distance, that's the worst thing that we can imagine. So we definitely want to keep in mind that limits are only needed when they're needed. They're only set when they're required. And once we understand that, that brings us to, why do we set limits in the playroom in a specific way in the first place? Because there are lots of ways that you can set a limit, but child-centered non-directive play therapy uses a very specific approach. And there's a premise behind it, which makes it very clear you have an opportunity to feel heard and validated. You also are going to receive a neutral limit, so it's not charged. And then you have an opportunity to choose to comply with the limit, or you have the opportunity to choose to not comply with the limit. So the child actually gets kind of a trifecta of benefit from this limit setting process, which we'll go over in just a moment, because the child is learning, they hear me, they understand, they validate me, they get it, but there are some rules, and I now have a decision to make. I can choose to comply or not comply. And in that decision-making process, they are learning ownership of choices, they're learning acceptance of consequences, they're learning self-control, they're learning self-regulation. So there's absolutely this sense of the limit setting process creates all kinds of lifelong skills that are attained that benefit the child. So let's look at the limit setting process. Now, I just said Gary and Landreth. Gary Landreth and Sue Bratton's model, they use an ACT acronym. So spells out ACT. The Van Fleet book and the Cochran's book, they do not have an acronym. They just discuss the steps of setting limits. And so there's a little bit of variation if you're looking at the Van Fleet book, also entitled Child-Centered Play Therapy, or the Cochran's book, or the CPRT program, you will notice that they handle limits a little bit differently, but the premise is the same. So because I'm most familiar with Landreth and Bratton's model, I'm just going to give you the ACT, which is straight out of the CPRT program. If you want to look at some variations, the Cochran's and the Van Fleet book are options as well, but it's really basically founded on the same principles. So from the Landreth and Bratton manual, you acknowledge the feeling first. That's your A in ACT. So you're going to acknowledge the child's feeling because behavior is always driven by feeling. And if we learn to look at behaviors and language in light of a root of emotion, it changes the entire dynamic in the playroom. Because a child throwing something, if we focus on the throwing or just the behavior, it's a very different response than if we focus on that's a clue into where the child is and what's going on internally. So when we acknowledge the limit, A in ACT, acknowledge the feeling, you are wanting to communicate, I get it. I understand. I'm validating you. I recognize what you're feeling. And what that might look like, practically speaking, is you really want to throw cars at the wall. You're so angry that you want to shove me to show me how mad you are. You really wanted more time in the playroom today, so you are trying to stay longer. So notice that the implication, going back to when we reflectively respond, the implication is you're not wrong for feeling this way. Feelings are always valid. Sometimes behavior requires a limit. So your feeling is valid. I get it. I understand. It makes sense that you feel that way. I'm not surprised you feel that way. I'm not confused why you feel that way. I get it. So the validation of the emotion is where we start. Why? Because the child needs to feel heard. You don't ever want a child to feel dismissed. And sometimes if we leap straight to the limit, it's dismissive of how the child feels. Because the focus becomes exclusively on the behavior. But we always, and I don't use absolutes unless I mean them, we always want the focus to remain on the child in a child-centered non-directive model. So you feeling word. Just like our reflective responding episode, when we reflect feelings, you emotion qualifier. So you're angry, you're upset, you really want to throw that, you are having fun climbing the shelves, you are whatever. So you're saying, I understand what is driving your behavior right now. Then you move on to the C in ACT, which is communicate the limit. So you communicate the limit neutrally. And if you could see me, I'm emphasizing the word neutrally. I hand gesture a lot when I podcast, and my husband continues to tell me that he eventually wants to video record me podcasting because he thinks people would get a kick out of watching me podcast instead of listening to me podcast. But I just made this monstrous gesture and then I realized no one can see me except myself. Anyway, I digress. So the neutrally word is what I was emphasizing with my hand gestures, because if we set the limit with any kind of charge or ineffective language, the result will be different. So let's unpack that a little bit together. So a neutral limit communicates you're not wrong for wanting to, but this is the limit and expectation. So the model that's most effective for this is A is not for B, or X is for Y. So let me give you actual examples. So the wall is not for throwing cars at. So A is not for B. The wall is A, is not for B throwing cars at. X is for Y would be markers are for paper. And in that scenario, the child's trying to draw on the carpet or themselves or me or something else. So it would be markers are for paper. A is for B. X is for Y. Okay, so notice that that's neutral. Notice that you're not saying you shouldn't color on me. You can't throw the cars at the wall. It's not a good idea to spill the water on the floor. I don't think you should. You're not allowed to do that in here. That's not okay. All of the phrasing that kids hear all day, every day, in every other environment, it creates either a willfulness to prove you wrong. So you can't throw the cars in here. Yes, I can. Watch me. Right? So it creates the desire to prove you wrong, or it creates a power struggle because they are now trying to reclaim the power that you just tried to take away. So when you say, you shouldn't pour that like that because it's going to spill, there's defensive reaction and there's grasping at power that ensues. So the neutrality of your limit is one of the most important pieces of limit setting. So A is not for B, X is for Y. If you say it in any other way, they can misunderstand, they can misconstrue, they can get defensive, they can try to prove you wrong. There's all kinds of negative outcomes if it's phrased in a less effective way. So that's a really important part of the C, which is communicate the limit. The neutral limit is the biggest piece. And then your T is target the alternative, which is essentially choice giving, which is why we did choice giving last episode, right? So then the goal becomes, you've already reflected the feeling. You acknowledge the feeling. There's your A. You've set the neutral limit. There's the communication of the limit. You move into the T, target the alternative. You are essentially giving them a choice that allows them to engage in the original desire or intent that they had when they were doing something that required a limit. So let's go back to the throwing cars at the wall scenario. Okay? So the child obviously had a reason, an emotional reason, for wanting to throw cars. Are they engaging in self-challenging play where they're trying to hit a specific mark on the wall? Are they angry and they're engaging in aggressive play, their aggressive theme? Are they engaging in competence play where they're trying to prove that they can do something? There's always a why, okay? So the reflection of feeling says, I understand why you want to do this. I know you think it's fun to try to do this. I know you're really trying to hit the bullseye. I know you're really upset. I know whatever it is, right? So you're validating. The target, the alternative, the choice comes in, but it's not just giving an alternative. It is providing choices that allow for the original intent and desire to be met. So it has to be congruent with what they were doing in the first place. So if they're mad, throwing the cars at the wall because they're angry, the choice that you provide, the alternative, the T, target the alternative, it has to make sense for an angry child that needs an outlet for it. So I'm going to give you a what to do and then a what I don't recommend you doing. So what to do would be, you're so angry that you want to throw cars at the wall, but the wall is not for throwing cars at. Or the cars are not for throwing at the wall. Okay, so there's your A and your C. Your alternative comes in. This is how you would do this appropriately. You can choose to throw the soccer ball at the wall, or you can choose to throw the darts at the wall. Which do you choose? Notice that it's still an angry release, it's still aggressive play, and it still allows them to throw something as hard as they want at the wall. Because it aligns with the original intent. They were throwing cars because they were mad, and they needed aggressive outlet and channel for their emotion. Now, what I do not recommend as a choice would be, you can choose to use the cars to drive on the mat. Because they're using the cars as projectiles. So giving them an alternative of driving the car on the rug, you know those little kid rugs that have like the tracks and stuff, the roads? A lot of play therapists have those rugs. So I was using that as an example. Or you can choose to race the cars on the floor. That is not congruent with what the child needed. So you want your choices and your alternative to make sense, that it will allow the child the original expression of the desire or the intent or the need. So, for example, child wants to color. They get markers out and they start drawing on themselves. Okay, so in that scenario, you would actually need to be witnessing and watching and paying attention, because the reason for them drawing on themselves could be many different options. It could be they're testing boundaries. It could be they're trying to draw tattoos. It could be they are drawing a bracelet on themselves. I mean, who knows what the scenario might be. And again, getting back to when we talked about limit setting in the playroom, you have to decide what you choose to set limits on. So in my playroom, kids draw on themselves. Other play therapists do not think that is appropriate, and so they set limits on it. So remember, is this limit necessary? Can I allow this behavior and still accept the child? And can I consistently enforce this limit if I set it? So those are your 3 questions you ask. If you missed the limit setting discussion earlier on, go back and listen to some of the archived episodes. You have to be aware of whether or not you need to set the limit. But if you decide that a child drawing on themselves because you think mom will be upset, or they're going to school afterwards and they can't have marker all over themselves, whatever, that's your discretion as a therapist. So in the scenario where I said markers are for paper, markers are for drawing on paper, that would be a limit where the child was trying to draw on me or the wall or themselves or the carpet or something like that. So I know you really enjoy drawing with markers, but markers are for drawing on paper. So you can choose to use construction paper or you can choose to use easel paper. Which do you choose? Notice that she still gets to draw, she still gets to color, but the choices that were provided are appropriate behavior-wise. The therapist is okay with either option. And then the child is able to choose, do I choose construction paper or easel paper? So that is the limit setting process. And I want to share one more little anecdotal story because I think it kind of helps understand what it looks like from a child's perspective. So because we don't set limits until they're needed, and because we don't start off the session with all of the rules and expectations for the playroom, which, by the way, it's really important the very first session, when you first take the child back, it's important to share with them the introductory phrase, if you will, or, whatever your initial welcome to the playroom discussion is. Because of Landris model, everyone at my center says, this is our playroom. When you are in the playroom, you get to decide what we do, and you can choose to play with all the toys in most of the ways that you'd like. So that's our phrase. The Cochrane's opening statement is, this is a special room. In here, you may say anything you want, and you may do almost anything you want. So notice that in both scenarios, you're communicating freedom, autonomy, independence, and you're not starting off with, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And the goal is for the child to realize, I can be free, and if there's something that isn't okay, they're going to let me know. And that's when the limit setting process begins. So I've had multiple children share with their parents that there's only one rule in my playroom. And ironically, every child tells their parent that there's only one rule, but it's different than the other rules that the other kids think exist. So one child has mentioned, there's only one rule in the playroom, and if you climb all the way up to the top of the shelves, you have to sit on your butt. And that's because that particular child always climbed my shelves, and it was a safety issue. I had another child say, do you know the only rule in the playroom is that I can't hit Miss Brenna with the darts out of the crossbow? And that is because that child played with the crossbow every single week, and I got hit several times, and the crossbow shoots hard and fast. And even though they're suction darts and they're not supposed to hurt, they really do leave marks when they come out of the crossbow. And okay, let me pause really quickly there because this aligns with limit setting, and I think it's helpful, especially if you're trying to get into this field and understand what it's like in the playroom. There are therapists in my center even, but there are therapists all over the world that would say, if you have a crossbow that shoots that fast, then you should just not have it in the playroom because then you don't have to worry about getting shot with it. And there are people that will live and die by that belief that if you don't like something in the playroom, take it out. I personally have made a choice. I have a regular bow, which shoots far less quickly and aggressively, and then I have a crossbow. And the crossbow is trickier to load, it's trickier to shoot. It shoots harder and faster, and so it serves a completely different purpose than my original bow and arrow set. And I have chosen willfully to keep it in there, even though it can hurt me and other kids, and it can leave marks in the walls and all of those things, only if the arrow is shot backwards, which lo and behold, I had one child that figured out how to shoot an arrow backwards, and so the end, the hard plastic end, was actually hitting the wall and it left dents. And I thought, I really should not be surprised that kids can figure out the craziest things. But my one kid did. So I had to patch some dents in the wall. But the moral of the story is I'm aware of the risks that come with that crossbow, and I choose to keep it in there because I think it is an opportunity for children to self-regulate and self-control and to learn to comply with limits. Because when I set limits with the crossbow, they have an opportunity to choose to comply or to choose not to comply. And it's a powerful learning tool. They learn very quickly to have empathy. They learn quickly to have worldview. They learn quickly to understand how to comply with limits. I think that it is worth the risk. It's a risk-reward calculation, right? And so I have chosen to leave it in there. But back to the original story. I've had a child say, the only rule is that I can't shoot Miss Brenna with the crossbow. And you can see it changes the one rule, I'm air quoting, the one rule that exists in my playroom changes for every child because the limits are only needed when they're needed. And I never had to set other limits with those children. That was the only one that was set. So in their mind, there's only one rule. But imagine if I would have on week 1 said, okay, so I'm not for shooting with the crossbow, and the walls are not for throwing cars at, and markers are not for coloring on yourself or others. And it's just a totally different vibe. So the goal is self-control, self-responsibility, self-regulation, and the ability for the child to understand that actions have consequences, and therefore the choices that you make influence other people, the scenario, the future, the circumstances, etc. And that is what we are hoping for, is that children learn to recognize that it is not just about them in that moment, and therefore they have to develop self-regulation. So that is the limit setting process. We talked about it in the 6-part series at the very beginning. So if you missed that, if you want more information about these pillars, I went in much greater depth in that 6-part series at the beginning of the podcast. I believe it was episodes 4 through 9. And so if you want to check that out, please feel free. But we are moving into ultimate limit setting next time because you will eventually need to learn how to expand on your basic limit setting. When certain scenarios arise in the playroom, you will default to ultimate limit setting, and we will talk about that next time. As always, thanks for being with me. Please shoot me an email if you'd like, brenna@thekidcounselor.com. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.